Ladies and gentlemen, I've received a question with a donation, and the question is, how is it that philosophy is so prone to being ridiculous, whereas other things like engineering and chemistry are tied to reality, where structural and chemical engineering are held to rigid and realistic standards, for his words. Now, I'm not going to really answer the question as it's posed. I'm going to address the question satisfactorily, I think. But as it turns out, philosophy is prone to nutcases and whack jobs, just as structural engineering and chemical engineering are. But philosophy has to be put in order first before chemical and structural engineering even come into existence. That's what's odd about the question as it was posed. Not that he posed it incorrectly, but I don't think he saw the implication. Philosophy was there before chemical and structural engineering became what we think of them as today. We would not have science as we have it today were it not for Galileo and Newton and Charles Darwin and men of their caliber, men who had philosophy down first. Then they were able to create things like higher mathematics, structural engineering, figure out the chemical tables and stuff. If they were at all confused about the nature of reality and whether or not they were dealing with the real reality, they wouldn't have been able to do what they were able to do. They induced correctly for all of reality and all of time and all of history because they were able and willing to take the facts available to them and do what we call concept formation. So, like Darwin forming the concept of evolution and Newton forming the concept of gravity. Galileo form a concept? I don't know. I'll get back to you on that. It's not the point, though. These men had their philosophy down and were therefore able to create what the questioner would say are rigid and realistic standards. Rigid and realistic standards are not necessarily believed in by everybody. Okay? If your philosophy's wrong, you aren't going to believe in rigid and realistic standards. So, why is it that philosophy is prone to be invaded by this stuff? And I'll have to say the other stuff is prone to be invaded by it too, or else what was all of history? You call today's chemical engineering is nice. You call alchemy chemical engineering or not? I don't, but you can't say it's not a predecessor, right? So what is it when philosophy is not the guide for these people? What is it that they do? They do things like alchemy and what is it called? The apothecaries of the 1800s, 1700s. An apothecary is a place where you get medicine. But medicine didn't start helping more people than it killed until World War I. So to say that these sciences are held to rigid standards begs the question of philosophy, of where they got their rigid standards from. So philosophy is prone to be invaded by all manner of crazy things, as is every single other branch of human endeavor. But philosophy slightly more so. Here's where we address, I think, the point of his question. Philosophy is particularly prone to these sorts of invasions because it deals with the broadest abstractions. Now, an abstraction, as you know, is just grouping things together and taking their measurements off. Like you group wooden chairs, metal chairs, plastic chairs. You forget about what they're made of. You forget about what country they're made in, what color they are. All their measurements you leave aside, and the one essence of a man-made object for one person to sit on inside of their home or whatever. That sort of definition is what you take as chair. That's an abstraction. Now, the abstractions of philosophy, such as ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, economics, aesthetics, these are extraordinary abstractions. These are floating. When you say, what is ethics? And I say to you, well, it's the question of what you do when you get up in the morning. Do you focus or do you loll about for the day? It's the question of what do you do when you're hungry? Do you go rob your neighbor or do you get a job? It's the question of what do you do when you see a newborn baby? Do you take it under your protection or do you start cutting pieces of it off with sharp knives and stones? Like, circumcising children and stuff. And I'm not talking about cutting the foreskin off. That is a medical event done in the Western world. Cutting the foreskin's not what I refer to. I refer to cutting the head of the penis off. You know, what kind of things do you do when you're in the world facing choices? Now, you take all those things that ethics comprises and have one word for it. That's very difficult for some people to deal with. And ethics is not actually a very abstract branch of reality. What about epistemology? Because philosophy deals with epistemology. When you say, well, epistemology is the way that you think, and how do you know what you know? Well, that right there is going to make a lot of people's heads swim. And then you get to metaphysics, and you say, well, metaphysics is the nature of reality. And is it independent of us or dependent upon us? That is the only real issue in metaphysics. Do we go to reality to figure it out, or does it get created by us, or is it inside of us? Well, some people are just not going to get these things. And there are actually some people in the field of philosophy, writing and publishing, who don't have the first clue what the subject of epistemology or metaphysics correctly defined is. That's why it's more subject to craziness, but you can't say that the others aren't subject to craziness. Philosophy comes first in this. This is why the whole of human progress could be seen today to be teetering on a knife edge of some kind. We've had what we have today for 200 or 500 years, if you want to stretch that. We've had hard science as we know it today for less than 200 years. And to say that science is always held to reality, whereas philosophy isn't, is bizarre, because philosophy is what holds science to reality. So, the question's malformed in that sense. The real question is, why is philosophy so prone to be invaded by bizarre ideas? And as the ancient Roman, I don't remember who, said, an ancient Roman senator, emperor or something, he said, there's nothing so absurd that you won't find philosophers talking about it. That's because it deals with the broadest abstractions. It therefore takes the most intelligence. It takes enormous amounts of evidence, philosophy does. And if you go astray, it is most difficult to see where you are astray from reality. Therefore, flights of fancy are less easily detected than they are in science and the hard engineering. But as long as you remember that little bit, that science and engineering are only held to standards of reality because of philosophy, as long as you remember that little bit, you'll remember how fundamental philosophy is, and that the flights of fancy in it are particularly dangerous.